I'm very sympathetic with Bern's remarks, and I hope we can talk about them in the discussion. I want to really thank Ravi Agarwal for his excellent background note, which has been very instructive for me, and I'll take my cue from a number of things he says in it. First of all, I want to begin by acknowledging what he says, that there is a twin danger of stressing the Anthropocene and reactions to it. One of the problems with talk of the Anthropocene is that its emphasis on anthropogenic interventions into the Earth system stresses all of humanity. And as Ravi Agarwal points out, it may well be that when one is apportioning blame, one would really have to focus on more specific groups of human beings. So there is a sense in which the rhetoric of Anthropocene leaves out politics, just for that reason. On the other hand, politics, and progressive politics as well, often has, over the last many decades, left out questions of ecology and nature. So there is this twin danger of narrowing ecology, sequestering it into some ghettoized idea, and on the other hand, making politics narrow by leaving out the deep facts about our environment and the crisis we face. But part of the, I mean, it's a very interesting thing to me that when I was a teenager and all through my college years, both here and in England, a lot of us were on the left, and we didn't ever really take up ecological issues. The left was really never concerned with future generations in those years of the new left. And that's really a very deep flaw in the left. But I also notice now, when everybody in the West is obsessed with environmental issues, that these people who are obsessed with environmental issues paid absolutely no attention whatsoever. They were never made anxious in the past by questions of global poverty and global injustice. The environment affects everybody, so it becomes a real issue. But the very people who are obsessed with the environment in the West were never made anxious by global poverty. So there's a real sense in which I think there is a failure on the part of the politics of the last half century to take up questions of ecology. All right, so let me focus on another aspect of Ravi Agarwal's note, and that is, since our topic is partly at least to do with India, I want to eventually, he says, when he says that there is a great emphasis in addressing issues of nature and politics to take a top-down approach. And when you do that, you basically leave out values and forms of local governance and the attitudes, both of life and rule, such rule as there is, in local groups, especially indigenous groups. And I think that that is a very telling thing, and I want to do that after I present my argument. So let's start with India and work up to longer intellectual and wider intellectual history. Let me begin with a remark by Amartya Sen, one of our most humane economists. You remember that there was widespread protest some years ago when there was an eminent domain form of dispossession of petty producers, basically peasantry, by corporate projects that the government was endorsing, sometimes called special economic zones. And there was widespread protest, and Amartya Sen's response to the protest was to say, England went through its pain to create its Londons and Manchesters. India will have to do so too. Now, for a historical analogy that is very historically imperfect, when England went through its pain to create its Londons and Manchesters, the people of England who were dispossessed migrated in very large numbers to other temperate regions, mostly to North America. There is nowhere for the people of rural Bengal to go, given immigration laws. When the mobility of labor had some parity with the mobility of capital, you could make Sen's point. But now, with the mobility of capital ever since the remantling of the Bretton Woods institutions, the mobility of capital is fantastic at the press of a button. The mobility of labor is completely hampered by immigration laws. No such thing existed when London and Manchester were created. So for a historical analogy, it is completely off beam. Now, why did Sen say that? What were the assumptions behind Sen's remarks? Well, one assumption is that what happened in the West must inevitably happen in the rest of the world. Okay? That's a clear assumption of saying what happened in England must happen here, in its erstwhile colony. That's a clear assumption. Okay, so now why would one make that assumption? I mean, if as humane an economist as Sen can make it, it's everywhere in the zeitgeist, that assumption. Right? So what underlies that assumption? Well, one thing you might think that underlies it is that Sen and others are committed to the iron laws of history. That's a term that Marxists use. So what happens in the West must happen elsewhere. But Sen is not a Marxist. He is not making that assumption on Marxist grounds. So on what grounds is he making that assumption? Which is a very widespread assumption. It's just part of the zeitgeist of economists. I mean, I think economics is a fraudulent discipline, but it's very widespread, and it's a discipline that has an enormous effect, and it filters down into people's everyday sensibilities. So what is underlying it, if it is not these iron laws of history that some Marxists attribute to Marx, not Sen's view? Well, it comes from a liberal tradition. And in liberalism, it's not determinism or iron laws of history that make you embrace this assumption, but it's rather the idea that what happened in Europe was rational. And so it ought to happen everywhere else. Not that it will happen everywhere else, that's the iron laws of history view, but it ought to happen else. What happened in Europe ought to happen everywhere else. Why? Because what happened in Europe was the rational thing to have happened. Right? So the idea of the state of nature as it has, the idea of a state of nature as it has dominated our thinking about nature and politics, which is the theme of Ravi's background note, by asking what made this view about the creation of Londons and Manchesters rational in Europe. What was the underlying ideology that made it seem rational? And the answer is got to do with how the state of nature was conceived, not by Hobbes. I read something in the Hindu today, which was a report on this this conference, a sort of trailer for this conference, which talked of Hobbes as the contractual idea of a state of nature. But really, I think the themes that are important, in particular, I'm taking my cue, as I said, from Ravi Agarwal's background note, it's this notion of the state of nature that's important is really Locke's notion of the state of nature, which is the liberal view. And Locke's view of the state of nature goes something like this. So suppose all of us are in, just let's take this room full of people. So we live in the commons, let's say. We have a commons. Let's say it's land. I mention all this because clearly fresh air, the atmosphere and so on is the commons. So it's highly relevant to raise it through the notion of a state of nature. So we are all here in the state of nature. And Locke's view is that some of us, let's say half of us, this half, each one of us comes across a stretch of land, and each one of us just fences it. And we set up a bureau, and we register, each one of us registers this fenced thing, and we call it ours, mine, yours, etc. Now, Locke's idea is that a state of nature becomes a polity and human beings become citizens if they choose, if they get together and choose principles to live by. As soon as they choose principles to live by, that's called a social contract, people become, human beings become citizens, state of nature becomes a polity. So I raise this as a point about rationality. Locke's idea is that these principles to live by, if they are rational in some sense, then human beings become citizens and the state of nature becomes a polity. So what notion of rationality do they have? What is the social contract's notion of rationality? Well, the idea is that if the things you do that make you a citizen, choose principles to live by, make you better off than you were in the state of nature, if the principles you live by, thereby becoming citizens, make you better off than you were in the state of nature, it is a rational arrangement. All right, so the idea is if some of us fence land, register it, call it our own, basically privatization of the commons, we're better off. All right, so what about the others who haven't done that? Well, Locke's idea is we hire them to work as wage laborers for us, and they are better off than they were in the state of nature as well. So everybody is better off the state of nature. Right? That's Locke's argument in the chapter on property in the second treatise on government. It's as simple as that. It's contractual. Contractualist justification for this arrangement, which is the beginning of capital. Starts with land, moves on up industry to other forms of property. Okay, now I'm going to put in the mouth of a whole range of people who, let's stick to England, because this idea started in England, moved to other parts of Europe later, as did the Industrial Revolution. Let's start with England. In England, at Locke's time, in Locke's time, there was tremendous protest against what Locke was really justifying. What was Locke historically justifying? I mean, Locke is a philosopher, so he has a philosophical contractualist argument, which I've crudely presented. But what was the historical thing he was justifying? He was justifying what was called the enclosures, right? The enclosures of the commons. And the enclosures of the commons was done for many decades before Locke. But what Locke's argument does is to present it as a rational and moral political achievement. Right? What was done by brute force, right, was then consolidated as a moral and political achievement by the contractualist argument. All right, so there's widespread protest, some predating Locke, by a whole range of political actors, remarkable political actors, whose voices are completely lost because, histories, and including intellectual histories written by people who win. So these voices are completely silenced. But there were the levelers, the diggers, and all these dissenting groups in England who said, no, we have a different view of nature, which is, Locke is perfectly correct that we are better. I mean, they don't say it like this because the levelers and diggers were not salaried philosophers like I am. So I'm putting this in their mouth. But this is what underlies the protest against the commons, and what they were saying, put in anachronistic terms, is Locke is absolutely right that we are better off than we were in the state of nature with these arrangements, but we are not better off than we would have been. There's a counterfactual there. We're not better off than we would have been if the commons had not been privatized and there was a collective cultivation of the commons instead. So it's an argument from opportunity cost. I don't know how many of you are economists, but the idea of an opportunity cost is that if you make a choice, there's some benefits that you just simply avoided. Choices come with avoided benefits. So what, let's say, Winstanley says is, well, you've got this contract, the Lockean contract, but it's certainly true what Locke says, that it makes you better off than you were in the state of nature, but it doesn't make you better off than you would have been if the land was not privatized and there was a collective cultivation of the commons. Okay, so that's the basis for opposing the enclosures. It's an argument from counterfactual opportunity cost argument. Now, here's the interesting thing. For centuries after Locke, basically consolidated today by what is called game theory, but really for centuries, there's a way of thinking, a mentality, which game theory only gives a formal gloss to, fancy terminology and so on, but it's an argument that has existed for really centuries of Western liberal thinking, the thinking that underlies sense, remark, and the assumption I'm trying to diagnose. And the idea here is that this counter-argument I've just presented against the enclosures by the dissenters of the 17th century presupposes something that is irrational. And that is the idea of the collective cultivation of the commons. So, centuries of economic thought fortifies Locke's idea by pointing out that an opposing of Locke's idea by this opportunity cost argument presupposes a collective cultivation of the commons. That was clear in the way I presented the counter-argument. Well, the collective cultivation of the commons, according to the economic thinking that Martin and Bernd have been describing in different ways, is that collective cultivation of the commons presupposes cooperation between the commoners. Right? Cooperation is irrational. That's 250 years of thinking, which then gets formalized by certain arguments about collective action and game theory. Okay, so what is this anxiety about the irrationality of cooperation? Well, it goes like this. It says you have this idea, which is our subject, the state of nature, and if you have this opportunity cost argument, you presuppose collective cultivation, but that requires everybody to pay a certain cost of cooperation. Usually in the case of the commons, the cost is the cost of restraint. Right? So you shouldn't overgraze if it's a pastoral commons, you shouldn't overcultivate if it's an agrarian commons, you shouldn't use your air conditioners for too long if it's a fresh air commons, and so on and so forth. Right? So everybody must pay the cost of cooperation, which is very often restraint. Okay, so now every commoner has to, in the state of nature, has to consider whether he, well, if it was the agrarian commons of the 17th century, it was always a he, also always white, and he has to ask himself the following question about whether he should cooperate. He has to say, so let's think about, a commoner is now thinking, well, now I have to cooperate, because that's the only way that you can have a collective cultivation of the commons. Now, if I don't cooperate, then the gains will be immediate, right? I'll just get the stuff, the fish or whatever, if it's overfishing, or the crops, or it will be immediate. If I cooperate, the gains will be over a long period, collective. I mean, there's no doubt that if everybody cooperates, everybody gains. There's just no doubt about that. That's just axiomatic. So, but he says, well, if I don't cooperate, the gains are immediate. But if I do cooperate, long term. Also, if I don't cooperate, the gains are all to myself. Right? I'll get to sleep in comfort with the air conditioner all night, so on. But if I do cooperate, the gains are dispersed over everybody. Right? So, well, okay, so these are all sort of pushing him towards not cooperating. But here's the crucial step, which clinches this form of thinking, and that is an epistemological step, which is, what if I cooperated and the others didn't? Right? I can't be sure that others will cooperate. Right? So there's an epistemological problem. We're in the epistemic dark about cooperation of others. If I cooperate and others don't, that's the worst possible outcome for me. Right? If everybody cooperates, everybody gains. But if I cooperate and others don't, it's the worst outcome for me, and I don't know that others will cooperate. Right? So let's call this the qualm. Right? I have a qualm. Every commoner has a qualm. Right? If I cooperate, so let's call this the qualm that each commoner has. Now, if I have that qualm and those other two more subsidiary considerations of all to myself gains and immediate gains, by non-cooperation is completely irrational. But if everybody thinks this way and they don't cooperate, that being the rational thing to do, then the commons are destroyed. That's the tragedy of the commons. Right? So this is published in a very famous paper in, I think, Science by Garrett Hardin. It's called The Tragedy of the Commons. There's nothing original about that paper. He's just summarizing a whole centuries-long tradition that followed Locke, basically fortifying Locke against opportunity cost arguments of the sort I gave, which presuppose the collective cultivation. That's the state of nature's starting point and corruption. Okay, so that's what. Now, I really do have a lot more to say by way of constructing an argument, but I shouldn't talk for too long. But let me just say that what I think is very important about Ravi Agarwal's statement about indigenous groups and governance, so on, and values, which are simply missing in other forms of thinking about values and governance, is that, in my view, this is my view, I believe that much more important than the values of liberalism, including equality, right? I mean, who can think that equality is a bad thing or liberty is a bad thing? These are liberal values which are remarkable. But I think the deepest thing one can get from indigenous groups, local groups, including religion and so on, is that the worst thing is not lack of liberty, nor even lack of equality, but alienation. Better ideal than even liberty and equality. Don't get me wrong, I'm not against liberty and equality. I would like liberty and equality to be necessary conditions for a more fundamental value, which is the value of an unalienated life. And that really comes from the locality of indigenous traditions. It's everywhere in indigenous traditions, everywhere in localist ways of thinking about society. And if you understand what that value is of the unalienated life, let me define it for you. For this idea of a state of nature and commons and so on, I'm going to just give a stipulative definition of what I mean by the value of an unalienated life. If you're unalienated from nature and from each other, the qualm never occurs to you. It never occurs to you to say, what if I cooperated and others don't? This is not solidarity. It's not the idea that Martin was saying, that I should have brotherly feelings, I should have altruistic interests. No. No, I'm just saying it should never occur to you, what if I cooperated and others didn't? That is, your mentality should be such, if you're unalienated, that the thought never occurs to you. Not that you think the thought is wrong. I really want to make this distinction. It's not that you think the thought is wrong. The thought never occurs to you. That's the ultimate goal of the kind of politics, I believe, that Ravi is raising. But it is we're looking at the beginnings of capital and capitalism, and it's flowering with this thinking that underlies it. Now, look, there's a very simple point, which is, in my view, the real enemy today. Please don't be shocked by this, because I'm not trying to be flamboyant. I really believe it. I believe the real enemy today is liberalism. This is what I've been working up to in my criticism of the assumptions behind Sen's remark, which are very widespread assumptions. In fact, Sen's voice is a very decent voice on this point. On other matters, he's just wrong about this particular thing and the assumptions it makes. I think liberalism is the real enemy for a very simple reason. If you take contemporary populisms today, the liberals are wringing their hands and are constantly criticizing Trump, Brexit, all these things. But the liberals, it's a completely fraudulent criticism. The liberals are completely complicit in the rise of right-wing nationalisms and populisms that they've come to despise. They're completely complicit in it. And it's a very simple point about as to why this is so, and really is the basis of what I've been saying all along about this way of thinking and the mentality that gives rise, that underlies the nature of capitalism, which of course has transformed into a very neoliberal mode since the 1980s. And that is, let's just take what our subject is supposed to be, which is the environment and nature. Martin has said this in some terms. Burnt has said it in some other terms. I've been trying to construct an argument to say this. It's every serious person who writes on the environment today, every serious person, everybody's writing on the environment today. There's been almost no subject which has that much punditry in so little time, the last few decades. But every serious person who's writing on it, and there are not many of them, will tell you that there cannot be a way of addressing the environmental crisis unless you find a way of bringing a terminus, not just constraints, a terminus to capitalism as we know it. Nothing else will address the problem sufficiently. Just constraints of one or other kind, we know will not address it because it's the nature of capital to overcome constraints upon it. What did the Bretton Woods institutions do? Right? They completely overturned the entire period of Keynesian demand management. So there's constant overcoming of constraints on capital. You simply have to find a way of producing some form of terminus on capital, neoliberal capitalism as we know it. Okay, so here I'll end with the following thing to show why this whole argument from Locke, Sen presupposes, and the rationality behind it is the real enemy is take the following truth. If I'm right, the following is just true. So say P entails Q, where P, what substitutes for P is there is an environmental crisis and Q is, what substitutes for Q is only the terminus of capitalism as we know it, will address the crisis. Okay, so P is there's an environmental crisis. Q is only a terminus of capitalism as we know it is. Now, if P entails Q, if this is true, as I've been arguing, that was the point of mine, the liberals have been attacking, for example, Trump and his supporters for denying P. Right? So there's this hysteria. Trump and his supporters are denying P. But 99% of the liberals who have disdain for the Trump supporters for denying P, deny P entails Q. Now, why is it more irrational to deny this truth than it is to deny this truth? Thank you very much.